thank you so much for staying with us. It will seem like we're taking everything in that same economic space, just so that Nigeria can be incrementally productive. Not too long ago, as you've seen, President-elect Bola Ahmed Tinubu said one of his immediate goals, I was in his conversation with the Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, is to implement institutional reforms and development programs that strengthen the nation's democratic institutions and assist the poor and vulnerable Nigerians. And Halera and I were just going through a list of those institutions that need the reforms. What do you have on your list?
Customs, immigration, the civil service.
Civil service. Even the vice president, when he became, vice president, was one of the first few things he was mentioning about. Maybe there is more. Let's ask our guests, both of them joining us in Abuja studio this morning. Dr. Okey Ikechukwu is a leadership and governance consultant. Thank you so much for joining us. He's right there with Dr. Toby Oluwatola, who is of the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Yes, let me begin with you, Dr. Ikechukwu. So, first of all, when you heard this statement or you came across the information that that's the primary thinking of the president-elect, or one of his first thoughts is institutional reforms, how did it come across to you? Are you hopeful, or you think it's just one of those things they say?
Hot air.
Well, it's not one of those things they say when you consider that his intention and concern is to make positive impact. I've been part of several reforms in the last 22 years of democracy, active involvement. Whereas the president-elect is correctly concerned about the need for reforms, I think he may need to think more of institutional and human capital reorientation in addition to reform. When you speak of reform, you can reform the structures. I heard you and Alero, your colleague, chuckle a little when you mentioned customs and the rest of it. Now, if you're going to reform customs, you can work on the laws, you can work on efficiency, you can even procure equipment. But your earlier conversation was about national productivity. That's the way I'll capture the earlier conversation with the two gentlemen. If I'm working in customs and I'm primarily and solely concerned about increasing revenue for the federal government, I will not consider the impact of excise duties on national productivity. If I'm in FIRS and I'm only concerned about tax, and I'm sure as the two of you are aware, immediately, I think during the COVID-19 pandemic or immediately after that, companies in several places, including Abuja, were being charged to have their places fumigated. That's after had been shut down for 6 months, some of them without any income. In other countries, the concern is, let's help these companies revive, because if they are working, there will be people employed. Yeah. So that's why I want us to first make that distinction so that the president-elect's good intentions are also not misguided. We need institutional reforms, but first of all, and most importantly, the service orientation of Nigerian institutions need to be refocused. Namely, Nigerians must be alive in order to pay tax. Companies must exist in order to pay tax. If you're taking material food items from local areas, and like you said, somebody will need 40 or 60 permits, nobody's asking you to pay that thing against the background of the value of what you have in the trailer. It may turn out that by the time you finish paying, you're getting only 18% of the actual value that will have been profit. And so you find that the issue is we need reforms, institutional reforms. We need also a new focus on service delivery. And that's why this is a good opportunity to also ask him to query institutions that are supposed to be, take Servicom for instance. The business of Servicom is a service compact with Nigerians, and every incoming president ought to actually get a brief from Servicom showing that as an institution that exists to monitor service delivery, it will tell the new president, look, in the last 4 years, this government has carried on, this is all the money spent, this shows that it was well spent. That then you're summoning institutions to pay rolls. to play roles in national development, not keep them as silos that pay salaries. Oh, I'm working in this place, I'm working in the other place. The nation is going under. Institutional reforms, let him also look at the development banks, whether for agriculture or the others. How much are they given in the last year? How much are they given in the last 4 years into the sector they're supposed to finance? You look at housing, NSITF, how many houses have they built? That way you see that the new government will actually be gearing and fully geared to ensure that whatever reforms are being carried out at the level of public administration will be matched by the right attitude of Nigerian workers and Nigerian institutions.
Dr. Oluwatola, Mr. Ikechukwu has spoken about policy reforms, but sometimes it seems that the policies are all there, but they haven't been well explained to carry the people in these various agencies along. For instance, I'm sure customs policy does not allow them to collect bribes, but we know that all they do on the streets and at the borders is to collect bribes, because they have not been carried along, or they are not on the same page as those who make these policies. So the problem now is how to get them to fall in line with the various policies that are made.
That's an excellent question, Alero. And first of all, let me thank you and Ayo for having me today, and more importantly, for driving this important conversation around setting the agenda for the new administration on very important topics like manufacturing, getting the economy productive again, as well as institutional reforms. Mr. Ikechukwu said something, Professor said something very important when he said the core thing is productivity. Productivity is everything, and we've got to have a productivity focus. Now, one of the things that, before I get to your specific question, Alero, I also wanted to stress that this topic you've also picked around institutional reforms is important. It was Darren Achimoglu and James Robinson in their book, Why Nations Fail, that highlighted that really the difference between poor countries and rich countries is usually comes down to the strength of institutions. By the strength of institutions, I mean institutions, do they follow, is there a rule of law? Is there respect for property taxes? Is there respect for property? And is there transparency? Is there strong transparency in processes of how things are done and what the expectation should be? Nigeria, in most poor countries, Nigeria inclusive, you open a business, you do your financial model, you expect that, you know, these are your expenses, these are your revenues. But in Nigeria, you know, things just happen, you know, and there's an anyhowness to how things happen. You import stuff and duties that you didn't know you were supposed to pay, you end up paying. Things that are not clear. There's a general lack of transparency. When you're trying to get a permit, the guy at the permitting office is really just thinking about what's in it for me, and not thinking about how do we be productive. So when the president-elect is signaling that institutional reform is a priority of his, it's very important, and that's a great thing. Institutional reform is what we need. But in the end, what does that mean? 10 years ago, we had a report called the Orosoye Report that said that the cost of government was too expensive and we needed to reduce the number of agencies. At that time, there were about 547 agencies. Today, there are 940 something and about 541 corporations. The number has tripled since that report came out. And so we've got to be very deliberate about what we mean and how we go about addressing it. To your specific question, I think that a lot of the accountability and the signaling has to start with an attitude of the leader, a political will on the part of the leadership. You've got to come in on day one and show that a sense of movement. Show a sense of movement that indicates to everyone else this new direction. The new direction that we will not tolerate certain things, the new direction that productivity will be the most important thing, the new direction that corruption would not be tolerated. You've got to set that tone. Then you've got to have solid performance management in place. Professor talked earlier about Servicom, but several other institutes of government which should exist to provide accountability don't do that accountability job. Obviously, I will, because I'm a media person, and I think the media is really important in this role, and the Constitution, Section 24 of the Constitution, gives the media a responsibility to participate in government by being a watchdog and an accountability partner to government. So the government has to really carry the media along, both in its external communication and in its internal communication as well, in its internal communication to public servants across the country.
Dr. Oluwatola, I'll speak to you.
A unity of focus.
My apologies. Yes. I'll come to you on that, because I believe that the major challenge any government since 1993 or thereabout has had is communicating with people. And without communicating with the people, they will fill in the gaps. But I'll come back to you on that. Let me take Professor Ikechukwu up on this one. Well, Prof, apparently there's been some structural adjustments to your title over time. I wasn't even aware of it, forgive me. But you know, the issue that, you know, this whole institutional reforms thing will have is going to be quite a lot. What, in your opinion, should Nigerians expect? I mean, thankfully, you said you've been through a good number of institutional reforms over the past 22 years. In terms of institutional reforms, what should Nigerians expect and how should they take it? I'll give you an instance. I mean, Dr. Oluwatola just talked about the 1,484 ministries, departments, agencies, and corporations of the federal government alone, according to Ben Akabweze. Now, if, for instance, the government comes in and says, the EFCC was a product of the police. It's supposed to be a function of the police. Let's merge the EFCC with the police, just for instance. And then the ICPC also is actually the job of the police, but because they weren't, you know, proactively doing it well, that's why we had to have an EFCC. So let's merge them all together. Is that the kind of thing that we are talking about in terms of institutional reforms? You know, essentially factoring in the Orosanye report, or there's something else that Nigerians need to understand when they hear institutional reforms and they begin to see that government is taking some steps along that line? How should they understand what institutional reforms are when it starts to play out?
Actually, what is to be expected is institutional transformation. In other words, reform the institutions so they function in such a way that they deliver efficiently and effectively and in a cost-effective manner. Now, you mentioned, it's interesting you mentioned those institutions, so let me stretch them further. If there's a case of fraud, probably a minister or a governor is arrested, the fellow gets tried and all, every other thing goes on in that regard. But look at it this way. For that fraud to take place, let's suppose it's inflated contract, in the ministry, you have procurement unit, you have transparency monitoring unit. If it's a very big contract, it goes also to what is called the due process office. Final approval is given. If there's something wrong, somebody gets picked up. Now imagine that if there's a case of fraud, you begin from the lowest to the highest level. The director of finance in the ministry is brought up for questioning, the procurement unit is brought up, transparency monitoring unit is brought up, due process office is put on trial. You find that the sense of culpability spreads so widely that the incentive to misbehave disappears. Now, I believe and I expect that when you speak of reforms, what Nigerians should expect is that institutions of state will deliver the services which will impact their lives, not announce budget. And I'll give an example. If you recall the last Executive Council meeting of this government before it came a second time, The sum of 4.6 billion was approved to be used in setting up 6, model secondary schools in the 6 geopolitical zones. Also, if you recall, 2 years ago, thereabouts, I think Kebbi State spent 4-point-something billion also in building brand new primary schools across the local governments and I think the wards. Now, everybody says that's wonderful investment in education, and I tell you no, that is investment in education infrastructure. And if you look across all the states, we have a ruling elite that mistakes investment in education infrastructure for investment in education. So they will call the tapes. Now, you and I know that a brand new building does not give you any lectures.
Yeah.
It is teachers. It is the lead teaching aids. It is the impact on consciousness of people. So you find that the kind of reform Nigeria should expect is not just an announcement of transformation. That's why I mentioned orientation and attitude. To begin with, the Orosanye report you mentioned, what was its objective? To trim down the institutions of state such that jobs that 2 people can do, you don't need 10 people to do it. But here we have a crisis because the current government has increased the number of such agencies and is creating more. That's a major issue. If you're talking about governance reforms, we must ask questions about organizations or institutions like NDDC, Northeast Development Commission. Are they helping public administration? Should they exist? When there are states, govern your state. So the kind of reform we should expect from the new government, if and when it's sworn in, is to drive efficiency, cost-effective management, proper orientation, so that institutions first don't work at cross purposes. You know there's interagency rivalry. At the same time, you're creating more and more institutions. Look at the laws, for instance, on civil defense, police, several others. They all have the power to make arrest and detain. Meanwhile, the CID department has not been disbanded. So these functions, picture a situation where there's a crime and all these agencies are together. Each of them will want to declare I'm the one who solved it. So if there's a piece of evidence agency A has, it will not give it to agency B, and that's the rivalry you're talking about. So in all of this, putting it together to the substantive issue you raised, what should Nigerians expect? I would rather say, what should the leadership expect in order for Nigerians to remember again what it means to have a government? Leadership should realize that every expenditure ought to impact the welfare of the people. Every investment in infrastructure must have multiplier effect. Road construction, you spoke earlier in your earlier entry about ease of doing business. The point is there is ease of doing business, which may be limited totally to regulatory issues, but there's also the environment of doing business. And your colleague mentioned excitedly, in my view, the fact of, look, the policy is there, but who is aware of it? What's the level of communication? And communication is not an announcement, an advert for policy. It's drilled down. Real orientation within the sectors, within the institutions. Why you exist is to do this. And in order to do it, this is how to do it. Now, those are the kind of details we need. Not a state of emergency. A state of emergency will be an announcement. If you announce a state of emergency in education, have you gotten more teachers? Have you gotten more funding? What is it you provided? You just made an announcement and created the illusion that you've done something. Please don't make an announcement. Solve the problem and stop embarrassing yourself.
Dr. Oluwatola,
yes.
Do you think that removing the human factor, the human being, from some of these processes that we have to go through will actually affect much? I was at the passport office last week, and I was very surprised to find that those people are still running around. We can fill the form for you, or we can take you here, or we can take you there. Even though I know that the Minister for the Interior, the Internal Affairs, has stated clearly that you should go online, fill your form online, pay online, book your date and everything online. And that, I suppose, was supposed to remove this human thing that I'm talking about. But those people are still there making brisk business. That's just one example.
and it's a fantastic example. So I think that I think that ultimately institutional reform has to be citizen-centered and in the last few years we've seen a few attempts. First of all, we start from a background where the history of the military rule really made a lot of institutions around individuals, around powerful individuals, and not about service to the people. And because of that process, you know, there's you didn't have the systems that allowed people to be able to have agency. So you're trying to get a passport, and people have created a process where it's in your interest to have a friend there that you can bribe, because the process itself is very cumbersome. And you now have, you know, just like you rightly identified, whether you're going to get your passport or going to get a visa, there's a small industry that has been created around those processes. So the thing is, we just have to come up with people-centered reforms. Reforms that make life easier for people. And I want to jump on the point that Professor Ikechukwu started, which is the point that the point around having more people delivering service. The truth is, Nigeria may have several industries, parastatals and corporations, over 1,400. But what work are these people really doing? And if you when you look at the numbers, Nigeria has, if you use the IP system to estimate, somewhere in the neighborhood of 740,000 public servants. And then if you add the state governments and if you had all the other agencies that are not in that system, you don't get to 2 million. That's about 10%. Wow. That's under 1% of the population. If you go to the UK, it's the public service is almost 10% of the population, about almost 6 million, as opposed to a population of 67 million. So the reality is that we don't have a lot of public servants. The problem, because when we talk about merging institutions, people quickly start to think, oh, it can be political suicide, unemployment will result. The problem is not that we need to reduce the number of people that work in government. The problem is that we need to give them work to do that actually needs to be done. Work that actually makes the country more productive. Work that actually provides service to the people. We need more firefighters. We need more teachers. We need more doctors. We need more people who can actually provide accountability and performance management and track what agencies of government are doing and disseminate policies down the chain to the agencies and track the implementation thereof. Nigeria just released a national development plan a couple years ago, and that plan has key performance indicators. It has key metrics that we want to track. Granted, one may think that, okay, it may not be as rooted in the realities of current day Nigeria as it should be, but at least it gives a direction for where we ought to be going, and that's work. Making sure we implement that and we track that we are implemented is work that public servants need to be doing, and not just sitting in office, pushing files around and waiting for an opportunity to collect rents.
Professor, it is called the public service for a reason, but our basic problem seems to stem from the fact that those in the public service don't even believe that they are there to render service. They believe that they are big men and big women, and they should lord it over the people whom they're supposed to serve. How do you then cause a change in their mentality so that they accept that they are in the public service, and it is called a service for a reason?
Well, that's where leadership comes in. That is where leadership comes in and is critical. And I'll cite 2 or 3 examples, some of them deriving from experience working in the public service to administer reform. 2004, the Minister of Information. The minister made a simple point. This is a professional ministry. Information officers are supposed to dominate it. They are supposed to be well informed. And public communication must not be on national television because the Minister of Information has structures all over the Federation. So what do? Prepare content, send it out, get the people to know what to do, and that worked for a while. But then you move on to another ministry, and you find that the same problem persists. Where there is leadership, what immediately happens is that there is a template for public administration. There are reporting lines, there are key performance indicators, you begin to measure them. Imagine that in all ministries today we have the right type of people as head of those agencies who know what to do, who are really interested in public service. The first thing that will happen is that the bulk of the staff who don't know that they ought to make reports of what they do on a regular basis will be forced to do so. So, taking the example in information, we now instituted a practice whereby every chief press secretary, sent in a report to the minister every week. Out of that report, he tells us what percentage of it was published and what was internal communication. Because what Nigerians don't know is that every chief secretary is an employee or should be an employee of the Minister of Information, because it is through him or her that information flows to the Minister of Information, who then communicates with the nation on what is going on in every ministry within the Federation. So that's the fact on one side. Then with that, something else emerges also. That's part of the crisis. All agencies of government are totally overpopulated. And so you find an office that you have probably 4 people, there are 11 of them who don't really have anything to do, and who probably agree among themselves, okay, you will come on Tuesday, we will come on Wednesday, Bayo and Musa will come on Friday. They are there, they are earning salaries. If no service is delivered, it doesn't affect their pay, and that's the crisis. So why is that happening? Why are people rushing for government job? Because what government ought to do has been undone or not been done, or have been left undone for over 40 years, which is enable the private sector and entrepreneurship thrive. That's where jobs are created in all nations. There is no country that is doing well where you don't find more than 70% of the jobs coming from the private sector. But here it's all being shut down. And that's why I spoke about the environment of doing business. That's why we also talk about vocational school. Growing up, we knew there were driving schools. You will go there and spend 2 years. You're not just learning to drive, you'll also learn how to fix a car. There are plumbing, there are vocational schools, and all of that. So you find the full complement of human capital for a society is being produced. Now, all those things have been shut down progressively, so you no longer have plumbers properly trained. You no longer have places training professional carpenters and the rest of it. So everybody goes for a certificate and then begins to look for a job. On top of that, manufacturing suffers. Growing up, we knew there were construction companies. You know, you had Ude Construction. My older friend, now late, Chief, don't remember his name now, you know, had construction companies. So look at Nigeria today. When government is speaking of job creation, people are thinking of more opportunity to send in applications. Whereas what should happen, what drives the economy, is the reality of private sector enterprise as enabled. But the crisis in orientation, I'll keep going back to it. The conditions you're given for a loan, if you want to collect a loan to do business, the only reason why you collect that loan is if you hope to push drugs. Loan you collect at 30%, what are you going to do? What is it you'll do to pay that back? It's not going to happen.
Yes.
So you then find a further disconnect that the banks and financial institutions are posing very impressive profits in a totally unproductive and declining economy. Where does that happen except perhaps in hell? So a company look at the last profit of Zenith Bank. Now go and compare, and I'm talking about all the banks. Go and compare their profits, go and check what they give to agriculture, go and check what they put into everything that drives development, go and even check whether they are supporting the genuine efforts of the central bank in some of these programs, but they are posting profits that's coming from the moon. They are not impacting employment, they are not impacting productivity, it is on rent. So when you collect and pay at 30%, and pay it back, they post higher profit, but poverty is increasing. These are the disconnections or the dysfunctionalities that should worry any government that's talking about reform. Reform is not to have an event at the International Conference Center and read us a text on the decisions you've taken. Okay, with this now, this will happen to the economy, the usual English, the macroeconomic indicators. Please leave those indicators. Look at the condition of your cousins in the village. Can they now buy rice? That will tell you whether you're governing. That will tell you whether there's productivity. How much tomato is still coming from Jos? In the northeast, do we still get the kind of sugarcane and wheat we are getting? Those are the worries. So that government ceases to be an elite engagement for speech making and transforms into actual impact on the life of people.
You know, Prof, I said to one of our guests the other time, be nice. Please be nice. Because even though I know that this can be really difficult, because really, I mean, Dr. Oluwatola, I mean, you would, you can easily relate with this, where you seem to have to report the same issues over and over again, and it would seem like the issues are not just going away. But there's something beg your pardon, Professor Ikechukwu mentioned that I'd like you to speak, which leads me to the question that I wanted to ask you earlier about communication. He said that every spokesperson, essentially saying that the information department of any ministry, department, and agency ideally should be furnished by the Ministry of Information of the federal government, or perhaps even of the states as well. I have had a challenge in my own heart, personally, thinking about development from the perspective of communication. Unless we're able to communicate effectively to Nigerians that this is what is expected of you as a Nigerian, this reform of government is coming, and consequently we need to, put out information to people about that, it would look like nothing is being done, and consequently people will fill in the gaps whichever way they want. Take, for instance, the current one that a number of people are finding funny only because they don't understand it. The Federal Ministry of Aviation is changing name from the Federal Ministry of Aviation to Federal Ministry of Aviation and Aerospace. For the life of me, many people are wondering, what does that mean? Okay, how does it change the price of bread, to go back to Professor Ikechukwu's analogy the other time? So communicating these ideals of government to people is a challenge. How do we navigate that? Because it's going to be the same thing. If government comes up with difficult decisions that people do not understand, there's going to be a resistance. How do we ensure communication in a way that people will feel carried along and they'll be able to take ownership of government reforms?
Thank you very much. Ayo. I think one thing that government can do a lot better to communicate its work is, first of all, to improve transparency. I think that there are many media and accountability agencies, civil society agencies, who will willingly help communicate some of these words, the work, that the progress that is being made in government and policy making, if there is more transparency coming from the public administrators. The reason why the public administrators are often reluctant to be more transparent is often because, on the one hand, they probably don't have much results to communicate. On the other hand, it may be that they've implemented policies that in reality was meant to serve themselves and not the people. And many times that's the case. So you have, just as an example, the CBN policy, because it was talking earlier, Professor Ikechukwu, about how certain banks can declare extra normal profits when there is, poverty in the land, and the interest rates are so high that you can't really borrow to normal businesses. But then they're making a lot of money in exchange gains, because we have a policy that creates creates, you know, a very huge exchange rate differential that is just a rent for unscrupulous bankers. Then you've got a policy that was made that we all of a sudden just said, oh, we're changing all the naira notes, and just to target a few individuals, we will impose hardship on the people. So the point I'm making here is that it is very critical for the new administration as it's coming in that it prioritizes evidence-based policy making, and that it is transparent on what its expected goals are in terms of how the policy it is making is going to affect the lives of people. What sort of economic models, what sort of modeling is informing that decision? How are you going from policy to results? What is the sort of that results chain? Be transparent about that. And if you're transparent about that, and civil society and media sort of have the metrics at their fingertips to use FOI or to use dialogue to communicate these things, then things will be communicated. And I feel like a lot of it, many times when we communicate, it's also the truth that the fact that many times it's easier, the truth is there's complication here. It's easier to communicate, like Wike, when you said earlier that I built a road, people can see a road. But it's hard to communicate, oh, this village now has 10 more businesses than it used to have. But the truth is that we still have to communicate those things. We still have to not focus on just stomach infrastructure. We also have to focus on things that actually lift people out of poverty. And one thing I also wanted to comment on is this new administration seems very insistent on social development programs, and we've had lots of social development programs in the past, and just in the last few years of this outgoing administration, we had a whole ministry created, Ministry of Social Development and Humanitarian Disaster Recovery. Have we looked back to see all the monies that were distributed to individuals? Have we looked back to measure the impact that it's had? Have we looked back to examine this policy? Yeah, we're now taking a loan of $800 million to cushion the effect of subsidy. But have we looked back at the interventions that we had when Jonathan first tried to remove first subsidy, and there was a similar fund? Have we looked back to really examine critically whether or not the funding or the stimulus got to the people they were supposed to get to, or it only got to politicians and politicians' nominees? Have we examined that? And have we examined that the people who got that money had a distinct impact on their productivity, on their livelihoods? These are questions we need to be asking ourselves. These are numbers that we need to be examining before we make policy. And when we do that and we're transparent about it, it will be obvious.
Well, Prof, you're a professor of civil strategic management and human capital development. So this question is essentially for you. In communicating these things, at the end of the day, I mean, you spoke about the fact that we have a huge number of multidimensionally poor people that need to be brought out of poverty. This is not going to be done by magic or conjuring anything. It has to be done through the activity that will be carried out by people. So in terms of the institutional reforms that, according to the president-elect, will get people that will assist the poor and vulnerable Nigerians, what shortfall in terms of human capital development do we have that need to be filled expeditiously so that, as you said, it's not just talk or what Alero would call white noise, but it is actually actionable information?
Actionable information. Sorry, let me touch briefly on the issue you raised earlier about communicating with the people. Government and the institutions must make a distinction between information dissemination and communication. If I come to your village and I want to talk to your people and I walk in there, introduce myself as Professor Ikechukwu Emenai, I've come to tell you about this and that and that. First, Ikechukwu is not a very popular name in that village. My dressing is strange. The topic I have is unusual. But supposing I walk in and Ayo walks in with me, just by citing him, I already have 50% endorsement. This one looks familiar. Now, what am I leading up to? In every environment, there are centers of power which drive communication. I mentioned our stint in the Ministry of Information. We got there, apart from instituting the requirement that every press secretary is actually resident information officer sends in something. The platform of special assistants in the country, while they are special assistant to the minister, what I did was to now make it a regular monthly meeting on briefing among special assistants on what government is doing across other ministries. That's how information spreads. Then you move across to the states. When we were growing up, sometimes you see a Land Rover driving around making an announcement. That was the work of Minister of Information. Yeah. That was also why under Chikelu, the press center, National Press Center was rebuilt, so that you go there and get information about what's going on everywhere in the country without necessarily that thing coming directly just because the minister opened his mouth. So what am I leading up to? Information drilled down is critical to any form of reform, to any form of public administration, to getting buy-in from the people. Just like we're mixing up engagements in education, investing on infrastructure, you find also national communication for some time now has become expenditure on communication, not communication. Oh yes, we've talked to Nigerians, we advertise it in 10 newspapers. Are you aware that all the papers put together sell less than 2 million? Are you aware that more than 40% of that is actually unsold? Now, how many people have ever gone to take a newspaper in order to read a full-page advert from government? So you're recording expenditure. Okay, you've spoken to Nigerians on NTA, nothing wrong with that, it has a wider spread, but that's also a population that has no less than 68% lack of power at any time you're talking. So bringing it all together, leaders should engage in real platforms around them. Use the media extensively. I mean, the media. In addition, look for power centers, create platforms. When traditional rulers are having their monthly meeting, let a briefing be sent. When imams are doing something, those are Nigerians, not people who just watch TV. Now, what was this substantive matter you raised now? See how I've ran into a bush and I don't know my way out. What was your last question?
That's what happens when you're a professor and you're a lecturer, so I do understand. Well, you know, it's about around human capital development for...
Yes, human capital development.
Yes.
Thank you.
For helping
the national crisis.
For poverty alleviation, especially in the light of the institutional reforms, because when the reforms happen, it is people that will be used to execute them.
So in terms of human capital development, we take it at 3 levels. 1, at the level of political education. 2, at the level of the educational system. And 3, at the level of leadership, signaling, and impact. At the level of political education, parties exist because they have distinct ideas about leadership. If the parties begin political education the way we had it under Awo, under Sir Ahmadu Bello, under Zik, under very reputed leaders, you find that the reason you will be in APC and not PDP or NRC or whatever is because you accept the ideology. So parties must begin on a regular basis to ensure that every month there is at least one gathering or rally in one local government. You don't hold party solidarity meetings to win elections. You hold it to create and retain membership. So at that level of political education, you're creating many ideologues who believe in something. That's at one level. So that it's not when everybody comes to give them money, they take it. Then at the level of the formal educational system, 2 recognitions. Now, at the level of, in the north, you speak of the Almajiri system, and some people will say it's useless, they don't know anything. Somebody who can memorize the Quran and repeat it is not unintelligent. His problem is that you have not given him numeracy and literacy of the type he can use to engage in the economy. So I go to an Almajiri school, I've done very well, I can speak English, I know my numbers, I have some entrepreneurship skill, nothing is lost. So that's human capital development. Then at the level of the formal Western educational system that's dominant, teacher quality, that has to be reviewed extensively. at the nursery level, except in some places where it's really monitored, what you have as teachers are house helps and secondary school dropouts. At this primary level, poor quality teachers. Secondary level, the same thing. At the university level, you find that better paying sectors of the economy have, in the last 35 years, drawn away some of the best scholars. Some are still among the best who are there, but they are in the minority. And so what you find that in many cases, third-grade scholars are producing fourth-grade graduates, and that's what we are seeing all over the place. Now, how does all of this impact the quality of national human capital at the level of knowledge and values is very low? That will naturally dovetail into poverty. Poverty of thinking, poverty of knowledge will lead to people thinking of their stomach without thinking of the multiplier effect of accepting money just to eat at the moment. That's why you have people who are in Maiduguri. So you had the case of lecturers who were arrested, who were assisting Boko Haram. Their conception of the world has shrunk so much that this is the way they see it for the moment. So when government speaks of poverty alleviation, it's important to think of wealth creation. Because the moment you say poverty alleviation, what kicks into the mind of people is, what are we going to give them? They will come together, money is provided, or you say you're doing empowerment program, which is not wrong. But you see, these empowerment programs, there's usually no connect between the product and the market. You've called people, you've taught them how to make detergent and soap. The packaging will frighten any child, just citing it. You expect somebody will buy it, so they're not connected to the market. And that's why, like in the study we've done at the Development Specs Academy, you find that in nearly all the states of the Federation, if you take their records of empowerment in the last 8-12 years, you will not find for each one less than 40% of those who were involved in the previous one being involved. So it's now seen as a kind of recycling platform for sharing money. Productivity zero, unemployment going up, but yet each year you record thousands who were empowered economically. Well, so poverty alleviation, the concept should move to wealth creation in a sustainable manner. And the indices and the means of wealth creation should then be properly itemized and followed up. If you've trained 100 people, monitor them. If you train 2,000, monitor them. In fact, like in the one we did for, for Anambra State under P2B, 5,131 young people, they were monitored. After 6 months, the best 10 were identified and given extra money. They didn't know they were being monitored. So wealth creation in place of poverty alleviation. Because alleviation places you permanently on the dole. You need water. Take this pure water. I'll come back in the evening to give you another one.
It will seem like we're already starting another topic altogether, because HDI is a problem that has to be holistically taken care of. How that is going to happen with 70% fresh lawmakers in the National Assembly and 50% of governors just coming in who've never been governors before, perhaps never had any significant positions before, I guess we'll wait to see. But for now, we have to thank you, gentlemen, for being a part of our conversation this morning. Now, the promise is out, the word is out, expectations are very high. Our guests have given us some ideas as well as how to communicate these issues, as well as the people that will execute them. Professor Oke Ikechukwu, Leadership and Governance Consultant, Professor of Civic Strategic Management and Human Capital Development, as well as Dr. Toby Oluwatola, Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this morning, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you for having us, Ayo.
Thank you very much.
And Alero.
Yes, so we return after now to talk about something else, which is how do you remain healthy to do all these things we've been talking about all morning? That and more when we return. Please stay with us.